Good evening, Scott here, known as Cantaloupe to some online, and I'm bringing a video to you on a subject that's interesting to me. It might be of interest to you or someone you know. And I want to yap about something that I constantly think about in terms of our structure of government here in the US versus historical structures and some early objections and concerns actually in America. It may surprise you if you haven't heard about this or didn't learn in history class that there was not a unanimous consensus at the onset of the United States. There was not total agreement about what direction to go in as far as policies and freedoms and the type of oversight and infrastructure that our country now has. For example, you may have heard this funny word, antidisestablishmentarianism. It's a funny word, isn't it? It's a long word. Anti-disestablishmentarianism. What it actually means is people who are opposed to the separation of church and state. So I'm going to dig into this. It's actually a juicy idea if you get down to it. The separation of church and state. What is that? Well, if you also recall from history class, there were some major reasons why European settlers traveled across the Atlantic to settle in the United States, or at the time, North America, before it had formed into a country. And some of those reasons were to escape oppression, to gain freedom, or to flee religious persecution and other types of persecution. They came here for many, many reasons. Lots of people did. And one of those big reasons, the famous one, was the situation in Europe, especially in England and other countries, had the church and state very tightly combined in a single corrupt entity. And it was pretty patently corrupt, or else people wouldn't have objected to it and fled the continent. They really wouldn't have. They would have been, a lot more people would have been satisfied, I think, and there's plenty of historical evidence to show that it was corrupt. The abuse of power by the monarchs at the time was off the scale, it was off the chain. There was a huge revision, several historical revisions of the Bible itself. The king of the time, King James, for example, bought the rights to the Bible among other people. We don't know exactly what he changed, but it's conceivable and likely that he changed some things in favor of the establishment, in favor of obedience and subservience to his kingdom, his monarchy, right? Well, you probably saw the introduction of ideas such as confession, where he could keep tabs on people. You were required to repent and confess on a weekly basis. So he was kind of leveraging the things that were already in place as far as what people were doing and reading and believing and worshiping. He just leveraged it in his own favor, which we see all throughout history from the government towards the people. Among other things, besides confession, there was, rhetoric I think probably injected about obedience, some metaphors about shepherds and sheep and respect for authority, honoring authority. You see all this stuff in the Bible now, which it wouldn't surprise me if it had been injected by those kind of people. But here's the thing. This isn't really about that. This is about the situation in Europe before America was formed and the discussions that actually happened, that we have on record, that we already actually know about, some of the meetings and debates and disputes that gave rise to the documents in the United States that we now call, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, and all the things that form the basis of our current government. So I want to talk about anti-disestablishmentarianism one more time. And there's another word for this. Funny thing, once you understand the principle of it, that is, again, the objection or rejection of the idea that church and state should be separate. That's anti-disestablishmentarianism, if you think about the word. So it's an objection to the idea that church and state should be separate. And there's a word for this. It's called Christianity, isn't it? Hey, there's one word. Not necessarily just Christianity, but at the time it certainly was. It's the idea is that there should be a role of morality, representation, some kind of religious involvement and oversight, as opposed to what we currently ended up with, democracy. Let me compare and contrast these ideas. And granted, I'm trying to be fair in this video, like my other videos. I'm not necessarily peddling anything here, but you may agree with my observations at the end. I'm going to keep it objective as much as I can. So democracy has some opportunities. It has some very clear uses and values as far as preventing war, for example, resolving disputes as a last resort, or maybe a little bit sooner. But in this country, we arrived at the conclusion or assumption, if you will, that democracy is always best when it comes to representation, when it comes to policy making, and deciding what's legal and what's not in this country. But anti-disestablishmentarianists, aka Christians, people who thought that there should be Christian influence all throughout the government, like there had been at least a little bit before it became corrupted in Europe, they think differently, don't they? So they think, what do they think exactly? I'm just taking it apart logically. So they think that instead of popularity, which is what you have with democracy, instead of just deciding what the majority wants, be it moral or healthy or supportable or affordable or proper or not, that somebody with a spiritual leaning or moral compass, if you will guide the policy making and law making through channels of historical Christian values, which arguably aren't too bad if you look at them. The core values, that is. And I'm not talking about the monetization, the mega church, avarice stuff that you see nowadays. And it is, many of these establishments have gotten off the rails, but I'm talking about just doing what's healthy and safe and promotes the quality of life of the people the government represents. I want to be clear about this. I'm not selling this idea. I'm contrasting having leaders with moral compasses with what we actually have now, which is leaders who are obligated by law to give you what is popular by definition, to give you what you have democratically told them is required of them. Completely different thing. This is how we ended up with recreational marijuana right now in the state of California and other places. This is how we ended up with the repeal of prohibition, so that nationwide, except for very small places at certain hours, you can buy your alcohol, whether you like that or not. This is how we ended up with these things that aren't necessarily conducive to health and happiness in the long term. They don't necessarily support a cohesive, productive community, but they are popular, and there you have it. So again, last time, to summarize, anti-disestablishmentarianism is the idea that our leaders should be leaders. That is to say, they should not just be sycophants and puppets of democracy. They should not just respond to the voters, even if that's happening, even if our system was working as designed in principle, which is debatable, right? So my final question is, if we aren't even doing what is advertised in this country, that is to say that if our democracy, our votes and our ballots are for some purpose other than to actually decide policies, if those big decisions are being made in advance and we're getting a selection of placating decisions to make just to feel like we did something, if it turns out that that's what our brand of democracy is actually doing, and it turns out we already have leaders with values and compasses, so to speak, who are making decisions through those lenses, why don't we just call it what it is? Okay, let's be honest. Let's say that there's leaders. We have leaders. We don't just have puppets. And we might as well acknowledge that and begin with that reality. Call it what it is. Say our leaders are making spiritual decisions on behalf of the people already. Why not make it formal, since they're doing it already? Let's not just pretend that we have actual influence as voters. Maybe you disagree. Maybe you think that the selections you saw on the last ballot you filled out were pivotal. Maybe you believe that that stuff made a difference. I beg to differ. I have not seen any major options on any ballot, and I have voted before. I just feel like it's made to be a distraction. It's made to make you feel like you did something so you can say, I did my part. You go on home and you get back to work. Correct me if I'm wrong. If you feel different, if you support this or disagree with it, reach out with questions or comments to whitehotrobot@gmail.com. Thank you.